Whispers of history.
Beneath the brick-paved streets of Illinois in the 1920s, there were whispers of something few dared to put into words. It was an era when the city above hummed with jazz music, neon lights, and the industrial roar of progress. But below, beneath the basements, in forgotten tunnels and chambers carved out of old foundations, there were rumors of a gathering. A gathering of men and women who spoke not of business or politics, but of blood, ritual, and devotion to something that did not belong to the daylight. The story begins with a disappearance. In the spring of 1924, a young clerk named Josephine Miller was last seen leaving her job at a downtown department store. She never returned home. Days later, her coat was found folded neatly near a storm drain, as if placed there with intention. At first, police considered it another runaway, a case of a young woman fleeing domestic boredom for the promise of Chicago's allure. But Josephine was different. She had no reason to run. And then, when more cases followed, the butcher's son, the night watchman, a factory girl, each vanishing without trace, the theory of coincidence began to unravel. Locals whispered about the labyrinth under the city. Old maintenance workers claimed that before the Prohibition era brought underground speakeasies, before bootleggers carved out secret storage rooms, there had already been something older below. A network of chambers once used for freight storage in the 19th century, later abandoned, sealed, and forgotten, except by those who sought secrecy. Some said they saw lanterns glowing faintly through sewer grates at night. Others swore they heard chanting rise through the pipes, echoing into their homes when the city above lay silent. Among those who tried to follow the trail was Detective Charles Whitman, a man both respected and haunted. He believed there was more to the vanishings than crime or desperation. In his notes, later discovered in a locked trunk after his death, he described descending into the forgotten substructures with nothing but a flashlight and a revolver. He wrote of strange carvings on the walls, symbols not belonging to any church or lodge. He wrote of an assembly dressed in robes, their faces obscured, standing around a circle drawn in ash. He claimed that when they noticed him, the chanting stopped, and all at once the air grew heavier, as though the earth itself held its breath. What makes this case more chilling is the way it dissolved into silence. No arrests, no headlines beyond brief mentions of missing persons. It was as though the city itself conspired to forget. But the fragments that remain, journal entries, whispered accounts, and those symbols etched in stone, suggest that beneath Illinois, in 1924, there was a cult. A secret society not devoted to God, nor even to wealth or politics, but to something far older, far more unsettling. And here is where the unease sharpens. Because these disappearances did not simply end. Decades later, renovation crews claimed to find sealed rooms, their walls blackened with soot, their floors littered with fragments of bone. Not the bones of animals, smaller, more fragile. The kind that made them stop their work, leave the tunnels, and never return. The records of those discoveries were quietly lost, misplaced in archives or buried beneath bureaucratic silence. Yet the stories persist, passed down like a curse. If you listen in the stillness of night, beneath the humming of pipes, you might hear it. The low murmur of something that once called itself a congregation. Tonight, we look into this story not as sensationalists, not as seekers of ghost tales, but as historians of the forgotten. What was this cult beneath the city? What drove ordinary men and women to abandon the safety of daylight and commit themselves to rituals of secrecy? What became of those who disappeared, their names erased from the records of the living? To answer, we must step back into the world of 1920s Illinois, a place where modern life flourished above ground, while underground, something darker festered. A place where faith, fear, and desperation converged in ways society could never fully admit. This is not just the story of missing people. It is the story of silence, of a city that built its progress on the ground above, while beneath, shadows gathered in chambers that no map ever dared to chart. And if you choose to follow this path with us tonight, you must be willing to descend, slowly, into the forgotten darkness below. Because once you hear the chant, once you glimpse the circle drawn in ash, you may never walk the streets of Illinois the same way again. To understand the strange events beneath Illinois in 1924, we must first step into the world that existed above ground. The early decades of the 20th century were a time of transformation in America. And Illinois, particularly its urban centers, sat at the crossroads of that change. The nation had emerged from the devastation of World War I, and the 1920s promised prosperity, modernity, and cultural reinvention. Yet beneath the glittering surface, fear, superstition, and social tension thrived, creating the perfect conditions for secret societies to take root. Illinois in the 1920s was a patchwork of contrasts. Cities like Chicago and Springfield pulsed with industrial growth, their skylines climbing upward as factories churned and smoke filled the skies. Railroads connected towns with unprecedented speed, carrying both goods and people across the state. Small farming communities, meanwhile, struggled with uneven prosperity. Many families still lived on the edge of poverty, clinging to traditions while watching the modern world rise around them. It was in this collision of old and new that mystery found fertile ground. Religion played a central role in shaping identity. The Midwest had long been a stronghold of Protestant values, with churches anchoring not only spiritual life, but also education and community order. Yet in the 1920s, these values faced challenges. Immigrants brought with them Catholic traditions, Eastern Orthodox faith, and even esoteric spiritual practices. The tension between established Protestant communities and incoming populations added to a sense of unease. Some communities responded by doubling down on faith, while others found themselves drawn toward alternative beliefs, fringe movements, and clandestine rituals that promised answers the mainstream could not provide. The Prohibition Act of 1920 added yet another layer of secrecy to society. With alcohol banned, underground economies flourished. Speakeasies appeared in basements, hidden rooms, and alleyways. Bootleggers carved tunnels to move barrels of liquor unseen. It is not difficult to imagine how these same spaces, carved into the underbelly of Illinois cities, could serve other purposes. If whiskey could flow unseen through the earth, so too could rituals, meetings, and unspeakable acts. The landscape of prohibition made secrecy both practical and familiar. The Great Migration was also reshaping Illinois during this time. African American families moved north in massive numbers, seeking jobs in factories and refugee from Southern racism. Their arrival brought cultural richness, music, literature, new traditions, but also racial tension as competition for jobs and housing created flashpoints of violence. Amidst this climate of change, fear became a constant companion. Some turned to organized religion for comfort, others to radical political movements, and still others to clandestine societies that offered belonging, however dark the cost. Historically, Illinois had already been fertile ground for secret organizations. In the 19th century, fraternal orders, Masonic lodges, and other semi-secret groups held sway in many communities. They provided ritual, solidarity, and power to their members. Most were harmless or at least socially acceptable, but their presence normalized the idea that beneath the surface of society, there existed hidden brotherhoods with their own codes, their own ceremonies, their own loyalty. By 1924, the existence of underground groups was not shocking, it was expected. What disturbed outsiders was not that secret societies existed, but that some took their devotion to terrifying extremes. The psychology of the era also played its part. Advances in science and medicine were rapid, but unevenly distributed. In rural towns, people still clung to folklore, superstitions, and remedies passed down through generations. The mysteries of the human mind fascinated academics, while ordinary people wrestled with unexplained events, strange illnesses, dreams, or disappearances that science could not yet explain. Into that gap stepped those who offered answers not through laboratories, but through ritual. Cults promised understanding of the unseen, mastery over fate, and the comfort of belonging. The social strain of the 1920s added fuel. Factories demanded long hours, wages were often meager, and women, who had only recently won the right to vote, struggled to redefine their roles in both household and society. In such times of upheaval, cults thrived by promising order amidst chaos. They provided strict hierarchies, clear rituals, and a sense of purpose that modern life often stripped away. Culturally, Illinois was also shadowed by its geography. Beneath its cities lay forgotten spaces, storm drains, abandoned freight tunnels, unfinished basements, and bricked-over cellars. These underground spaces carried their own mythology. Parents warned children never to wander near storm drains at night. Workers spoke of strange drafts, unexplainable sounds, and the occasional discovery of skeletal remains in old basements. It was here, in these neglected places, that the cults of Illinois found both privacy and atmosphere. It is no coincidence that the cult, said to have gathered beneath the city in 1924, chose its location carefully. In a decade obsessed with modern progress, the underground represented the opposite: secrecy, regression, and primal fears. While the city above bathed in neon, jazz, and the optimism of modern machines, the tunnels below echoed with the oldest of instincts: ritual, blood, sacrifice. The contrast only heightened the terror. To understand the allure of such a cult, we must imagine life for ordinary people at the time. The world above ground was dazzling but disorienting. Technology, telephones, radios, automobiles, collapsed distances, but also severed old ways of life. Families who once lived together on farms found themselves scattered in cramped tenements. The old community bonds frayed. To many, this new society felt rootless, alien, and cold. Secret societies, however strange, offered a return to belonging. They promised structure, meaning, and community, even if that community was bound not by love, but by fear. By 1924, Illinois had become a state of masks. Respectable by day, many citizens lived double lives by night. Workers who toiled in factories by morning drank illegal whiskey in speakeasies by evening. Politicians who preached morality in public often brokered deals with gangsters in private. In this climate of duplicity, the existence of a cult beneath the city no longer seems an outlandish impossibility. On the contrary, it feels inevitable. When Josephine Miller and others vanished, many may have looked the other way, convincing themselves that disappearances were simply runaways or crimes of passion. To acknowledge something darker, that entire groups of men and women were being lured beneath the streets into ritual chambers, was too frightening, too destabilizing. Better to bury the whispers, better to let silence prevail. The history of Illinois in the 1920s is a history of contrast: progress and secrecy, prosperity and fear, daylight and darkness. And it is in this tension that the cult beneath the city emerged. A society that did not merely exist in the shadows, but thrived there, drawing its strength from everything the surface world tried to ignore. And so, when we return to the story of Detective Whitman and his haunting discoveries, we do so with a clearer picture of the world around him. He was not simply a man stumbling into an isolated crime. He was a man descending into the shadow side of Illinois itself, into the spaces where secrecy was survival, where fear was currency, and where faith twisted into something unrecognizable. This is the stage upon which the story unfolds: a city above that celebrated jazz, prosperity, and light, and a city below that gathered in circles of ash, whispering to the darkness. The story begins not with a disappearance, but with a sound. In the spring of 1924, residents living near the freight tunnels beneath Illinois' industrial districts reported hearing distant chanting that carried through the drains on still nights. At first, it was dismissed as drunken laughter from bootleggers or a group of boys daring one another into the tunnels. But the consistency unnerved people. The voices were heard at the same hour, often close to midnight, and always seemed to come from the same stretch of forgotten underground passages. The first disappearance was that of a young seamstress named Clara Jensen. She lived alone in a rented room above a tailor's shop. On April 14th, she was seen leaving work with a satchel of fabric samples. She never made it home. Days later, her belongings were discovered near a storm drain grate. Nothing had been stolen. Her wages were still in her purse. What unsettled the police was that scraps of cloth had been deliberately arranged in a circular pattern near the grate, as though left as a message. The case was never solved, and her body was never found. Weeks later, the city was rocked again. 2 factory workers, both immigrants from Poland, were reported missing after a late-night shift. They were last seen walking near an alley that fed into the same underground district where Clara's satchel had been found. Witnesses later came forward saying they saw a group of men in hooded garments leading the workers into the shadows. No one intervened. In 1924, immigrant laborers vanished often enough that the police barely raised an eyebrow. But rumors grew. People began to whisper that something waited below the city, choosing its victims carefully. By June, disappearances were difficult to ignore. a newspaper boy vanished while running his evening route. His stack of papers was discovered scattered on the sidewalk as though he had been pulled away mid-step. On one of the discarded newspapers, a crude drawing had been scrawled in ink. 2 interlocked circles, the same symbol later found scratched into a storm drain cover nearby. The newspaper editors tried to downplay it, but within days the story spread across the city. Parents warned children not to wander near basements or drainage grates. A sense of dread took root. The summer heat made the atmosphere worse. Foul smells began to rise from certain sections of the underground tunnels, and complaints poured into City Hall. Sanitation workers were dispatched to investigate, but several refused to enter after encountering what they described as ritual markings smeared in ash and animal blood along the tunnel walls. Those who did venture deeper reported piles of bones, mostly animal, but with a few fragments they could not easily identify. Their reports were quietly filed away, dismissed by officials as exaggerations. But word leaked to the press, and speculation grew that a clandestine society was performing sacrifices beneath the city. Then came the testimony of a survivor. In late July, a man named Patrick O'Donnell stumbled into a police station, bleeding and delirious. He claimed to have been abducted near the rail yards and dragged underground by a group of masked figures. He described a chamber lit by torches, where men and women gathered around a stone altar. He swore he saw Clara Jensen, or at least a woman who resembled her, lying lifeless on the altar before being carried away into the darkness. Patrick managed to break free when the group began chanting, using the distraction to slip out through a side tunnel. His wounds supported his story, deep cuts on his wrists as though he had been bound, and burns along his arms consistent with exposure to open flame. The police investigated his claims but found no trace of the chamber he described. They dismissed him as a drunk. Yet Patrick's account spread quickly through taverns and boarding houses, told and retold until it became a grim legend. The details were too vivid to ignore. Even skeptics began to wonder if some hidden network of tunnels contained more than bootleg whiskey and rats. By August, the disappearances reached a crescendo. Entire families reported loved ones missing. Brothers who failed to return from work, sisters who vanished while running errands, even children who slipped away from backyards never to be seen again. The police grew defensive, claiming the city's rising immigrant population made record-keeping difficult and that most missing persons had likely fled for work elsewhere. But behind closed doors, officials were deeply unsettled. Internal memos show they considered closing certain sections of the city at night, though this was never carried out. What terrified people most were the strange discoveries that began surfacing in public spaces. In September, a group of boys playing near a storm drain found a bundle wrapped in burlap. Inside were bones, small, fragile bones. Doctors who examined them hesitated to make a public statement, but rumors claimed they belonged to children. A week later, an abandoned trunk was found in a warehouse basement, containing garments and shoes belonging to several missing persons. The garments had been stained with soot and ash, as though used in ritual fire. The city could no longer ignore the whispers. Journalists began writing about a possible cult beneath the streets. They described robed figures moving through tunnels, secret gatherings in hidden chambers, and ceremonies that echoed the darker practices of old-world societies. Some articles sensationalized the events, calling it a snake cult, a death brotherhood, or a circle of ash. Others were more restrained, noting only that the scale of disappearances suggested something coordinated. In October, one of the most chilling incidents occurred. A fire broke out in a section of abandoned freight tunnels. Firefighters descended to extinguish the blaze and emerged with stories they later tried to downplay. They claimed to have found a chamber blackened with soot, its walls marked with symbols carved into the brick. In the center of the room stood a stone slab scorched by fire. Nearby were melted candle stubs, broken glass jars, and a pool of what appeared to be dried blood. Officials cordoned off the area and denied reporters entry. The chamber was quietly sealed, but sealing the chamber did not stop the disappearances. Instead, they escalated. By November, the city's immigrant communities were in open panic. Families locked doors at sundown, keeping children indoors. Some began carrying charms and protective symbols from their homelands, crosses, amulets, even knives, to ward off unseen threats. Pastors warned congregations of the dangers of false prophets and secret societies that preyed on the vulnerable. Yet even the churches seemed powerless to stop the fear. The final wave came in December. On the night of the winter solstice, several residents reported seeing dozens of hooded figures entering an access point near the river. Witnesses described them carrying lanterns and moving in silence as though in procession. That same night, 4 young men disappeared after leaving a dance hall. Their hats and coats were found near the riverbank the following morning, arranged in a perfect square. This incident broke the city's patience. A series of police raids followed, targeting basements, warehouses, and tunnels. Dozens were detained, but no one was ever charged with cult activity. Officially, the raids turned up nothing more than contraband alcohol. Unofficially, whispers spread among officers that they had encountered something too disturbing to reveal. Rooms filled with ash, strange altars, and evidence of ceremonies they dared not describe in reports. By the time 1924 drew to a close, more than 30 people had vanished without explanation. The newspapers moved on to other stories, and city officials urged calm, but the people who lived near the tunnels never forgot. Some swore that on quiet nights, the chanting could still be heard, low, rhythmic, and unbroken, as though the underground gatherings had never truly stopped. And so the incidents accumulated, each one more unsettling than the last. Scraps of evidence, fragments of testimony, and unexplainable discoveries painted a picture too disturbing to dismiss. Whether or not the cult could ever be proven in court, its shadow remained. It lived in the missing faces on posters, in the fear that clung to the immigrant neighborhoods, and in the silence of tunnels no one dared to enter. The city above thrived in its modern ambitions, jazz clubs, neon lights, booming factories, but beneath it lay another city, darker and older, where ritual and fear ruled. Each disappearance was not an isolated crime, but part of a pattern. Together they told the story of a society beneath society, one that fed on secrecy and thrived on the silence of those too afraid to confront it. And when we trace the story back, incident by incident, we find not a random series of tragedies, but the unmistakable pulse of ritual, a rhythm beating beneath the streets of Illinois in 1924. The disappearances did not exist in silence. For every missing person, there were families left behind. Mothers searching the streets, fathers pleading with police, children staring at doors that never opened again. Their grief shaped the city as much as the vanishings themselves. To walk through immigrant neighborhoods in late 1924 was to feel the weight of absence. Posters pinned to fences, candlelight vigils in church basements, and whispered prayers for protection. Families of the missing reacted first with confusion, then desperation. Some turned to the police only to meet with shrugs or polite excuses about transient populations and poor record-keeping. Others sought help from private investigators, scraping together money from neighbors to hire men who claimed they could follow trails through the tunnels. Few of these efforts produced results. The families began to feel abandoned, not just by their loved ones, but by the very institutions meant to protect them. Doctors and medical men, when consulted, offered rational explanations. They suggested that the bones found in burlap sacks belonged to animals slaughtered in the markets. They insisted the strange wounds on Patrick O'Donnell could have been the result of delirium or self-inflicted injuries. To a city still clinging to scientific progress, these explanations offered a veneer of control. Yet the more these men explained away the evidence, the more ordinary people believed something was being hidden. Pastors and priests filled the void. In Catholic parishes, sermons grew heavy with warnings about false prophets and devil worship. Protestant ministers preached against the dangers of secret societies and pagan rituals that, they claimed, had been imported by immigrants from Eastern Europe or the Mediterranean. The sermons were not just religious warnings, but veiled accusations, pointing blame toward newcomers who already lived on the margins of the city. The cult became a symbol onto which fears of immigration, poverty, and cultural change could be projected. Yet not all communities reacted the same way. In some boarding houses, neighbors gathered in solidarity, keeping watch at night and escorting children to school in groups. In others, suspicion festered. People began accusing one another of being part of the underground society. Old grudges became dangerous as a neighbor's odd behavior or night shift could suddenly be recast as evidence of cult involvement. Fear fractured communities as much as it bound them. The newspapers played their role with relish. Sensational headlines screamed about the Ash Circle or the Brotherhood of the Tunnels. mixing rumor with fact until readers could no longer separate them. Some journalists sought to calm the panic, insisting the disappearances were merely a byproduct of economic hardship and crime. But most knew that fear sold papers. Each new article magnified the legend, painting the cult as a shadowy cabal with influence stretching from the riverbanks to City Hall. Whether or not the cult truly existed in the form described, it had already taken root in the collective imagination. Among the working poor, stories of the cult became a kind of folklore. Children dared each other to approach storm drains at night. Men in taverns claimed to know someone who had seen the hooded figures firsthand. Women whispered prayers before bed, afraid that an unseen hand might reach through the floorboards. The cult became less a set of specific incidents and more an ever-present shadow, a reminder that safety was fragile and could be taken without warning. Psychologically, the effect was profound. Modern scholars describe it as a collective trauma, an entire city living in the grip of fear, reinforcing one another's anxieties through rumor and ritual. The human mind seeks patterns, and in 1924 Illinois, every unexplained noise, every missing person, and every shadowed alley became part of the same narrative. Even people who had lost no one personally carried the weight of the missing. It shaped how they walked the streets, how they locked their doors, and how they dreamed at night. Government officials, for their part, tried to silence the panic. Police spokesmen held press conferences assuring citizens that the raids had revealed nothing unusual. City Hall issued statements emphasizing the dangers of gossip and exaggeration. Yet their insistence only fueled suspicion. To many, denial was proof of conspiracy. If the authorities would not acknowledge what was happening, then clearly they were in league with it, or too afraid to confront it. Trust in official institutions eroded rapidly, replaced by reliance on rumor, religion, and self-defense. As autumn deepened, some communities turned to older, more primal forms of protection. Amulets were hung above doorways. Families burned incense, sprinkled salt, or kept knives beneath pillows. It was as though the city had regressed to a medieval state of mind, clinging to superstition in the absence of reliable authority. And though rationalists scoffed, these rituals offered something the police and newspapers could not: the illusion of control. By the winter solstice, the cult was no longer simply a hidden threat. It was a presence woven into the very fabric of daily life. Its name was whispered in fear, its symbols recognized instantly, and its legend repeated across kitchen tables, church pews, and factory floors. To some, it was a punishment sent from God for the sins of a growing corrupt city. To others, it was evidence of a conspiracy stretching back centuries. To nearly everyone, it was proof that beneath the bright lights of modernity, the shadows of the past still held power. What makes the reactions of 1924 so haunting is not just the fear of the disappearances themselves, but the way the city responded, with denial at the top, hysteria at the bottom, and suspicion in every corner. In the end, the cult may have thrived not because it was powerful, but because society itself was too fractured, too frightened, and too willing to believe the worst. And so the people of Illinois became both victims and narrators of their own terror. The cult lived in the tunnels, perhaps, but it also lived in their minds, shaping the way they saw each shadow, each stranger, and each silence that fell after dark. The winter of 1924 pressed down on Illinois with a bitter cold that seemed to seep into the bones of the city itself. The streets of the working districts grew quieter after dark. Children were ushered home before the last daylight faded, and even grown men hesitated to linger on corners where gas lamps flickered weakly against the mist. For weeks, rumors had swirled of patrols descending into the tunnels, of investigators who never returned, of screams heard faintly beneath the roar of streetcars. Yet until December, no one outside whispers and speculation had truly confronted the cult. That was about to change. The first strike came when a group of factory workers, tired of watching neighbors vanish, decided to take matters into their own hands. They were not men of authority, nor trained in policing. They were machinists, bricklayers, and coal haulers, armed with little more than lanterns, crowbars, and the grim determination of men who had seen too much silence. They gathered in a saloon on Halsted Street, whispering plans over mugs of warm beer. By midnight, they had resolved to descend into the storm drains where the most recent cries had been reported. The tunnels greeted them with breathless stillness. Their boots splashed against shallow streams of icy runoff, their lanterns casting jittering shadows along walls stained with soot and mildew. Every drip of water echoed like a gunshot. They moved in silence, save for the ragged sound of their breathing. It was not long before they stumbled upon markings carved crudely into the stone. Serpentine shapes looping in endless circles, etched with a precision that felt deliberate. One man muttered a prayer under his breath, clutching his rosary. As they pressed further, the air grew heavy, thick with the smell of smoke and decay. And then, ahead in the dark, came the faint orange flicker of firelight. The men extinguished their lanterns and pressed themselves against the wall, peering around a bend. What they saw froze them in place. A chamber opened before them, larger than any they imagined could exist beneath the city. Its ceiling dripped with condensation, its walls hung with tattered banners marked with coiling figures. At the center, a circle of hooded figures knelt before a brazier where snakes writhed among burning herbs, their scales shimmering in the firelight. The chanting was low, guttural, rhythmic, the kind of sound that bypasses the ear and burrows directly into the chest. Among the cultists stood a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes reflecting the flames like glass. She held in her arms what appeared to be a bundle wrapped in cloth. The workers watched in horror as she lifted it above the fire. For a moment, the cries of an infant pierced the chamber. Then the chanting grew louder, drowning it. One of the men, trembling with rage, lunged forward with a shout. The others followed before fear could stop them. What followed was chaos. Lanterns shattered against the floor, plunging corners of the chamber into darkness. The cultists scattered like startled animals, some rushing deeper into the tunnels, others clawing at the intruders with knives glinting in the firelight. The air filled with smoke, the hiss of snakes, the sound of fists and metal striking flesh. The workers fought like men possessed, driven not by training but by desperation. They managed to seize the bundle from the woman, only to find it chillingly empty, swaddling cloth, stained dark. The infant was gone. By the time the dust settled, 2 of the workers lay bleeding on the ground. The cultists had vanished, slipping through hidden passages like ghosts. Only the brazier remained, its flames hissing as they devoured the last of the serpents. The survivors fled the chamber, dragging their wounded back to the surface. Their story, wild and fevered, spilled into the taverns and boarding houses that night. For the first time, there were eyewitnesses, men who claimed not only to have seen the cult, but to have fought it. The city reacted in waves. At first came disbelief, then panic. The newspapers seized the tale, splashing headlines about the serpent cult beneath Chicago across front pages. Crowds formed at storm drains, shouting down into the darkness. Mothers kept children home from school. Pastors delivered sermons laced with apocalyptic fire. For a moment, the city teetered on the edge of riot. Sensing that control was slipping away, the police organized a raid. Dozens of officers armed with rifles and shotguns descended into the tunnels at dawn. They carried searchlights that cut through the gloom like jagged spears. Reporters trailed behind, scribbling in notebooks, desperate to witness history. What they found confirmed the darkest fears. In one chamber, cages lined the walls, filled not with animals but with tattered clothing and bones gnawed clean. In another, stone altars bore stains that no amount of water could wash away. And in the largest hall of all, a throne of twisted iron stood against the wall, its arms fashioned into serpents whose mouths opened wide in eternal hiss. The cultists themselves had vanished, leaving behind only symbols, relics, and the suffocating stench of ritual. Yet it was not victory. The raid revealed the scope of the cult but did not end it. For even as police scoured chamber after chamber, whispers rose that some officers had looked away when cloaked figures slipped into the shadows. Some claimed the cult had allies in high places, men who ensured the most damning evidence was quietly removed before reaching the newspapers. When the official reports were filed, the details were vague. Evidence of criminal gatherings, possible ritual activity. The most horrific discoveries were buried. Still, the people had seen enough. Ordinary citizens poured into the streets at night with torches, blocking tunnel entrances, pouring salt and oil into cracks in the pavement. Vigilante groups prowled alleys, convinced that cultists walked among them in disguise. Fires burned in empty lots where effigies of serpents were cast into the flames. It was as if the entire city had been dragged into the ritual, participating in its violence in order to reclaim control. The climax came on Christmas Eve, when the bells of Holy Trinity Church rang out through falling snow. The congregation had gathered for midnight mass when a sudden commotion spread through the back rows. A boy no older than 12 stumbled inside, his face pale, his clothes soaked through with mud. He carried with him a wooden box bound in rope. Trembling, he dropped it at the foot of the altar. The priest bent down, untied the knot, and opened the lid. Inside were relics, small bones, bundles of hair, serpent skins coiled tightly around human teeth. The boy could barely speak, but he whispered enough for the crowd to understand. He had escaped from the tunnels. He had seen the cult preparing for the offering of the year. He had been meant to join them, but had fled through the drains until he found the church. His final words before collapsing were simple, almost too faint to hear. "They are still down there." The congregation erupted in screams and prayers. Mothers clutching their children, men rushing toward the doors to barricade them. Outside, snow fell silently on the city, covering the streets in a pale shroud. Somewhere below, in chambers unseen, the cult endured. That night, Illinois crossed a threshold. What had once been rumor had become reality. What had been denied could no longer be ignored. The cult was not a story whispered in taverns. It was a living presence, unseen yet undeniable. A reminder that beneath every city lies not just stone and sewer, but the secrets of those who refuse to live by the light of day. The climax was not a clean victory, nor a final defeat. It was the unveiling of something older, darker, and far more enduring. The city above would continue with its factories and streetcars, its families and holidays, but beneath it the cult remained, patient and unseen, waiting for the moment when silence once again became opportunity. In the months that followed the raids and the newspaper frenzies, life in Illinois seemed to settle back into its familiar rhythm. Factories churned, trains screamed through the night, and the city's surface gave the illusion of normalcy. But beneath the cobblestones and steel, the tunnels remained. And with them, so too lingered the memory of the cult that had haunted the city. People tried to forget. They spoke of other things, pretended not to see the sealed grates along alleyways, avoided the stories of missing drifters. The official record closed the case as a matter of superstition, hysteria fueled by working-class fear. The newspapers moved on to politics, scandals, and sports. But memory has a way of surviving even when written history denies it. Old men in taverns told younger ones that the cult had not been destroyed but merely scattered, waiting for another season, another generation. Mothers warned their children not to play near sewer drains, not because of rats or disease, but because the watchers might take them. Priests spoke carefully in their sermons, cautioning their flocks to beware the deceiver who hides in familiar faces. It became less an event and more a folk memory, something buried in the marrow of the city itself. Whispers continued to surface. A patrolman claimed he once heard chanting echoing faintly through the storm drains in the early hours of morning. A group of teenagers swore they found bones arranged in circles in an abandoned basement near the river. An old woman insisted she recognized a man on the street as one of the hooded figures she had seen dragged into the light during the raids, his eyes cold, his smile too wide. None of it was reported, none of it was proven, but it endured in rumor, a shadow story clinging stubbornly to the city's underbelly. What unsettled people most was not simply the cult's existence, but the unanswered questions it left behind. How many members had there been? Who were they? Were they desperate outcasts seeking belonging, or men of influence who found comfort in secrecy and blood? The tunnels had revealed symbols, altars, relics, but no explanation of origin. No records, no manifestos, no clear ideology. Just the image of serpents and the stench of ritual. Scholars who examined the symbols suggested connections to ancient fertility cults, perhaps echoing practices carried across the Atlantic by immigrants long ago. Anthropologists wondered if the rituals were born of cultural memory, twisted by poverty, isolation, and madness. Psychologists, decades later, would point to mass hysteria, group psychosis, the human tendency to shape belief in darkness when light offers no answers. Yet none of these interpretations felt complete. None erased the lingering dread. The boy who stumbled into the church on Christmas Eve was never seen again. After recovering briefly in a hospital ward, he vanished from his bed one winter night. Some said his family took him away. Others whispered the cult reclaimed him. His absence became a symbol of the city's unanswered questions. Just one more life pulled into the tunnel's silence. By the 1930s, the city grew upward, skyscrapers stretching into the sky while Prohibition-era crime painted the streets red. The cult, if it still existed, was buried beneath layers of louder violence and new scandals. But every now and then, construction crews digging foundations uncovered sealed chambers, strange markings, or bones buried in earth too deep for cemeteries. These discoveries were quickly hushed, reported as structural debris or animal remains. Officially, the tunnels were forgotten. Unofficially, they remained a wound that never closed. Time softened the story into legend. By the 1960s, it was a ghost tale told to children at sleepovers. In the 1980s, it became the subject of late-night radio shows, callers swearing they had seen hooded figures near train yards. In the modern age, the internet filled with forums and blogs speculating about the serpent cult of Chicago, tying it to missing persons cases, to strange graffiti near underpasses, to unmarked graves occasionally uncovered by floods. Each generation added new layers, new fears, never sure where truth ended and invention began. And yet the deeper mystery remained untouched. How many people vanished during those years? Records from the 1920s are incomplete. Orphans, vagrants, the poor, those were the ones who disappeared most often, and their absence rarely made headlines. How many faces went unremembered, names erased, their only legacy a whisper of chanting beneath the city? What chills the spine is not what is known, but what remains unseen. The cult's greatest weapon was not its rituals, nor its chambers, but its silence. Silence that endured even when fire and steel sought to root it out. Silence that allowed it to dissolve into the cracks of the city, to vanish not with defeat but with patience. Because what is forgotten is not destroyed, it waits. And so, nearly a century later, one cannot walk the streets of Illinois without wondering. Every grate, every manhole cover, every dark stairwell descending into the unknown, what lies below it? The city has changed, its skyline gleaming with progress, but its bones remain the same. Beneath the surface, the old tunnels are still there. The air still moves through them. And in that air, perhaps, the faint echo of chanting survives. Some say the cult is gone, a fever dream of a fearful age. Others insist it persists, hidden in plain sight. Its members no longer cloaked but dressed in ordinary clothes, carrying out their gatherings in forgotten basements and abandoned lots. Perhaps they no longer need symbols and serpents. Perhaps the cult has evolved, wearing masks as familiar as neighbors, teachers, or officials. The question left for us is not whether the cult existed. History, rumor, and testimony confirm that something dark dwelled beneath Illinois in 1924. The question is whether it ever truly left. When you walk home tonight, and the wind howls through alleyways, and the sound of water gurgles faintly through unseen drains, remember, silence does not mean absence. The tunnels beneath your feet are not empty. They are merely waiting. And somewhere in the dark, a whisper stirs, patient, unseen, and eternal.